Got some of these? I've got 10 sensational ideas for using embossing folders. Let's get crafting. With nearly 3 full boxes of embossing folders, there's got to be more than just embossing a piece of cardstock. So I challenged myself to come up with as many ways as I could use this versatile supply. I'm going to show you the first 10. Number 1, ink the flat side to deboss my cardstock. So what does deboss mean? It simply means to indent an image into your cardstock. For this example, I'm using a Park Lane brand standard embossing folder. This one is called Vines, and I'm using Distress Oxide in Rustic Wilderness. Now you saw me rub the inside to see which side is the flat side, and once I've determined that, I am just running my ink pad straight over, but gently over that flat section. And I'm going to go ahead and put my piece of cardstock inside, and I'm going to run that through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. Now, if you're new to embossing, you will find that each machine is different. Each folder could be different for that machine. Since this one's a Park Lane, which is a Joanne brand embossing folder, it's very thin and it's not 3D. So I've used my platform top, my base, a metal shim, my embossing folder, and then a cutting pad. And you see that I have kind of tilted that folder to go through my machine. If you run it straight in, you'll find that it may catch and be much harder to process through your machine. Now I'm going to take this sheet of cardstock out, and you're going to see my ink has been depressed or debossed into the cardstock. Number 2, ink on the raised side to emboss. To emboss means to push a design into the cardstock and cause it to be raised. Here I'm using the same Park Lane Vines folder, and I'm going to ink the opposite side. So this is the raised side, and I'm giving it a good once over with the same Rustic Wilderness ink. Then we're going to run it through the embossing machine, or the die cutting machine, however you look at it, with the exact same sandwich since it's the same folder. For this example, now the ink has been transferred to beneath the leaves and the leaves remain white. In the previous deboss, you'll see that the ink was pressed or into the leaf pattern. So far, you've got 2 different looks with a very similar technique. It just depends on where you put the ink. Number 3, double ink embossing. For my third example, I'm going to stick with Distress Oxides in Salty Ocean and the new Scorched Timber. And I'm going to be pairing that up with this Sizzix 3D textured folder. This one's called Typewriter. It's really heavily textured. So I'm just trying to figure out where I want my base color, which is going to be Salty Ocean. And I decided to put this on the top of the folder. And you'll see that as I ink it up, exactly where that ink is going to end up transferring to. Now with a 3D embossing folder, I do lightly mist my cardstock. That loosens up the fibers in the card to produce less cracking. Now check out the results of this fabulous embossing folder. It's stunning. But as you can see, it left the letters white. So I'm going to use my second ink to get that double ink embossed look. And I'm just going to gently run my Scorched Timber pad over the raised portions. So this is where the double ink embossing comes in. For this week's card challenge, I'm challenging you to use one of these 10 sensational embossing folder techniques in your card making. Come on over to Facebook and join us on Village Card and Crafts page and upload to our album Your Creation. We can't wait to see what you do with it. Number 4 is our white pigment technique. For this example, I am using another Sizzix 3D embossing folder. This one's called Lacy, and it is a textured impression folder. And I'm going to use some purple cardstock. Once again, misting the back of that cardstock to loosen up the fibers before I emboss it. This embossing folder happens to be one of my absolute favorite, but as you can see, as beautiful as it is, the image doesn't pop. So with the addition of Hero Hues White Unicorn Pigment ink, I'm lightly rubbing over the raised portion, the embossed portion of that cardstock. And now you see that that image pops off the card base beautifully. Just remember that this technique does not work with white cardstock. Our fifth example is Distress Oxide blending. I've chosen 3 Distress Oxide colors: Fossilized Amber, Wild Honey, and Spiced Marmalade. And I'm going to use that with Honeycomb Frenzy Sizzix 3D embossing folder. When I ink blend, I prefer blending brushes. Now, these are YOSENG blending brushes from Amazon. They're very inexpensive and they do a fantastic job. In fact, I just got a second set for my dye-based distress inks. But if you struggle with blending, let me suggest you use watercolor cardstock. I can't tell you why it works, but it blends so much better than standard cardstock. Really, cardstock can make all the difference. Now you'll see that I flip this around and tidy up my workstation. I'm using a We Are Memory Keepers glass mat, and I'm going to move to my darkest color. So I usually do both ends and then I blend the middle back into both ends. So this is Spiced Marmalade. It's a little bit of an orangey color. When I ink blend, I like complete coverage. Now, that's entirely subjective to what you personally like. Distress inks aren't as opaque as the Distress Oxides are, and I really like that finish. So you'll generally tend to see me really ink heavily, so I get a dark, dark color result. If you're getting a harsh line in your ink blending, make sure that you're starting your circles off your cardstock. You want to blend into the cardstock, and then you won't get that harsh line. Now, you'll notice I grabbed a paper towel. Sometimes I use an acrylic block, but you want to protect that ink. Still is wet for quite a while, so I'm just protecting my ink from my inky fingerprints because for whatever reason, when I did all these techniques, I ended up with green and blue and brown ink all over my hands, but I'm okay with that. But you see that there's a harsh line there. I'm just going to take that wild honey and blend it into the spice marmalade. I'm going to go back to my spice marmalade brush and blend that into the wild honey, back and forth until I get a really beautiful blend. Now, I have to admit, this is a really cool folder. So I have spritzed the back of this cardstock, making sure that I don't get anything on my ink blended surface, and run it through my die cutting machine. Now, I made all these little folders for my embossing folder, and inside I leave a note to myself on the embossing sandwich for my machine. Number 6 is the resist technique. In this instance, I'm using Lisa Horton Crafts embossing folder. This is called Budding Bloom. Some sticky embossing ink, Versamark is my choice, and some type of white or clear embossing powder. I'm going to use Hero Arts embossing powder in White Satin Pearl. This is beautiful embossing powder. Now I figured out by touch where I'm going to place that Versamark, and I've decided where I'm going to place my card in the folder, so I'm not wasteful. I'm only using Versamark in the area that I actually need it. After embossing, I am going to go ahead and sprinkle my embossing powder over the entire surface, and it is literally putting the embossing powder in the indented, the debossed areas. And I've sped this up, but you can see the beautiful shine that this white satin pearl embossing powder has. I'm switching over to Distress ink as opposed to Distress Oxides, and I'm using Kitsch Flamingo and a water brush. And all I've done is smush some of the ink onto my glass mat, added a couple drops of water, and I'm basically just coloring over the raised images. And this one, I believe, is Mowed Lawn, and I'm going to do the leaves with that. This doesn't take any real skill. I am just very lightly going over the raised areas with a paintbrush. So if you don't have a water brush, no problem. Use some clean water and just a regular paintbrush and go over whatever image that you have for your embossing folder. I highly encourage you to shop your stash and create with what you already have. But maybe you don't have very many embossing folders and you want to give these a try. I'll link as many as I can find. They are older embossing folders. Many are still available, but I'll link them below so you can take a closer look. If you decide to shop, I appreciate you using my links. They're provided to you at no additional cost to you. But it does provide a very small commission to me if you shop them, and that helps to support my channel and my family, and I thank you in advance. What I do next is a perfect example why this is a resist technique. You saw me wipe up some green ink, and that's because I didn't stay in the lines and I colored onto my embossing powder. But the embossing powder resists the ink, so I was able to just use a little paper towel and dab it up. And that's why it's called the resist technique. This particular embossing folder is stunning and has a lot of additional lines in the flowers that you might not be able to pick up here on the computer, but it's showing me where to paint a little darker. So you're going to get your darker colors towards the inside of your bloom and the base of the bloom. So I have smushed some more Kitsch Flamingo onto my water mat or my glass mat, and I haven't added nearly as much water. It's much more concentrated for a darker color, and I'm just going to flick my color into the petals to get some more added dimension. A very easy way to get a variegated look. You're going to see that it really does make a huge difference. Check out the difference between the top and the bottom here. Truly, do not be afraid of this technique. It is super simple. Anybody can do this with just some ink or watercolor and some water. Going to do the exact same thing with Rustic Wilderness for a darker leaf base, and I'm just following the lines from the embossing folder. This one is one of my absolute favorites. It turned out beautiful. Number 7, double embossing. For this technique, we are going to be using a Sizzix 3D texture impression folder called Pinwheel, and some sticky Versamark ink, which I'm going to ink up on the raised side this time, along with some blue cardstock. So what causes this to be called double embossing? Well, we're going to use two different embossing techniques. The first one is the dry embossing technique right here with the folder going through the embossing machine. The second embossing for this technique is going to be heat embossing. I didn't quite feel like I had enough Versamark on my cardstock, so I'm just lightly rubbing my ink pad back over my design. And then I'm going to add Ranger Superfine Gold Embossing Powder. This one is, I don't want it to cover the whole thing. I'm being very gentle about where I'm placing it. I just want drips and drabs of it here and there. I want to create a kind of a vintage look with this technique. For the second emboss, you're going to go ahead and use your heat tool and melt that embossing powder. Do you have any fun ways to use embossing folders? Let me know in the comments below. Number 8 is tone on tone. This is a simple technique. I'm going to use some cardstock and this 3D embossing folder called Tropical Leaves by Sizzix, along with some Versamark. Now I have spritzed my red cardstock, run it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6, and now I'm just taking my Versamark and tapping over the raised images. I'm not squishing the pad into the cardstock. I just want the ink to end up on the top, the raised portion of the leaves, and it's going to create a darker look. As you can see, as the ink becomes saturated, it's going to show up much better. Number 9 is embossing on vellum. I've pre-cut a piece of Recollections brand vellum that I got from Michaels, and I am going to use it in a Spellbinders detailed embossing folder. This one is called Flowers and Leaves. Now, you don't spritz vellum because vellum is a sort of plastic. So spritzing it's not going to do anything. It's just going to make your folder wet. So I'm going to place that in there, emboss it, and where it raises the images becomes white. So you get a subtle two-tone appearance from vellum. Number 10, layered embossing. The first step here is to die cut some images. Now I am choosing to use the brand new Vault Wildflowers by Sizzix and Tim Holtz, and I've cut them into various shades of purple. And I'm going to use my Barely Arts Precision Craft Glue to attach them to my cardstock. So I'm going to speed this up because I'm literally just gluing on die cuts willy-nilly wherever they land. I just want to fill up as much of the cardstock as I can with these beautiful floral die cuts. Word of caution when using this technique, do not over glue. You really want to be spare with your glue um, because you don't want anything to seep out if it's not completely dry. Now, I do use acrylic blocks to weigh down my die cuts to adhere them better to my cardstock. I generally don't use my acrylic blocks for very much these days, except as paperweights, literally. With my die cuts adhered to my card panel, I am going to use a Sizzix 3D embossing folder called Swiss Cheese. And it's kind of just this random geometric circular pattern on different levels. Once again, I spritz the back of my cardstock and I'm going to go ahead and emboss that. Isn't this fun? I used a completely random pattern and embossed my die cuts right into my cardstock. And because it's got so much dimension, it's really cool. Want to see more exciting techniques? Check out my other videos. Thanks for watching. I'll see you real soon.